Welcome to the Road to Accountable AI. I'm Kevin Werbach, Professor of Legal Studies and Business Ethics at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. For decades, I've studied emerging technologies from broadband to blockchain. Today, artificial intelligence promises to transform our world. But AI won't reach its potential without accountability, mechanisms to ensure it's deployed in responsible, safe, and trustworthy ways. On this podcast, I speak with the experts leading the charge for accountable AI. Scott Zoldi is the Chief Analytics Officer at FICO. He is the author of more than 130 patents on AI and data science, and a pioneer in responsible AI practices. In our conversation, we talk about when organizations may want to use simpler, more interpretable AI models, the challenges of model development and governance, how FICO is using blockchain to track the activities in development and implementation of their models, the impacts of regulation, the impact of generative AI on how organizations think about AI responsibility, and why we should still be optimistic about addressing all of these kinds of questions of ethics and accountability that we talk about on this podcast. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Scott Zoldi. Welcome, Scott. FICO was in some ways one of the original AI companies, at least in the sense of business analytics, going back to the invention of the credit score back in the 50s. How does that long history influence the way that today you think about deploying AI?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. It's part of our legacy, right? We've always focused on having a responsible view on how we use analytics. Originally, back in the 50s, right, we decided that decisions could be made more ethically and more fairly through the use of mathematics, right? And that started what was the use of analytics and credit scoring, which evolved to the FICO credit score, which later on in the 90s, we also branched into AI with our fraud solutions. And so we've always had at the center of our mind a focus on the fact that we develop models that impact people. And therefore, those models, whether they be AI or something else, right, or machine learning or something else, needs to be built carefully and responsibly and reproduced and with a level of accountability around it. And so that's been a big focus for us, given the gravitas of some of the decisions that get made with these types of analytics and models that we develop at FICO.
So is it really from the consequences? Because many technologists for a long time said, well, this is just math, it's neutral, it's not biased. And we'll get into that. I think nowadays there's a lot more recognition of the problems. But what got the organization, what got you personally early on to put such an emphasis on these questions of ethics and responsibility?
So in the early days of credit risk, right, and it still prevails today, there are a lot of challenges with respect to discriminatory usages of models and of lending. And so back in the before we used math and models in making decisions about credit, whether you got a loan or not could be based on whether or not we went to the same church, did we go to live in the right part of town, right? And these are kind of very subjective sort of measures. And so it was from the very get-go in the launch of the way we developed analytics, we understood that we were actually combating a problem, which is the data back then and in the data even today is full of bias. And therefore, we go in with this view that data is dirty, data is biased. And so when we develop a model, we have to do that in such a way that we can ferret out where those biases could be, remove them, and build the most fair and ethical model possible. So I think that was really part of our origin story, if you will, in terms of why math would be more empirical, more fair. Right? We still have challenges today in how math gets used, right? How these scores get used, and that's a big part of the infrastructure, right, of how decisions get made. But we wanted to make sure that the models or scores that are used to help aid in making fair decisions are built to the highest level of standard possible from an ethics and fairness perspective.
What is the biggest challenge today as the models have gotten so much more sophisticated and we move to AI and deep learning, and it's not as clear even how you get from the input to the outputs?
So I think you've hit on it exactly, right? I mean, one of the biggest sort of challenges we have today that wasn't the case when I started here at the company 25 years ago is that we somehow all accept that AI is used to make all these decisions, and the models have become more and more complex. There have been more and more parameters. There have been people enamored with how quickly they can build models and how large these models can be. And they don't focus on the physics. Like I'm a PhD physicist and I think about physics, right? And I think the world is defined by laws of physics and types of behaviors that are relatively simple, right? So we don't need models with hundreds of thousands or millions of parameters to make it a credit decision, right? What we need level of transparency in terms of the types of models. But as an industry, right, we've kind of adopted these big models and somehow bought into bigger is better without and sacrificing the ability to actually understand what drives those outcomes. Now, if you look at things like the FICO score that we produce, we still use generative additive models for that. And primarily we do that because when we, let's say, Kevin, give you a decision, a decision gets made based on a score, and you say, well, I don't understand why that decision was made. We need to be tremendously factual in terms of what are the reasons or why you got the better score or the worse score, because you're going to need to act on that, right? Because you're still going to need to get that loan. And so for us, it's not just like, okay, yes, let's use explainable AI, which I like to talk about as being good, bad, and ugly, with most of it being bad and ugly, right? Let's focus on interpretability as job one, because if I tell you these are the 3 reasons why you didn't get the best score, then you could go and act on them. And if you did that, right, we would see that consequential sort of improvement in the score. And that's the level of sort of visibility, which is these scores are not so meant to block, right? They're meant to assist and provide understanding of what that outcome was and maybe how you improve that outcome in the future.
Clearly that matters in credit scoring, where, as you're talking about, there are human consequences and it's in many cases regulated. Do you think that in general that companies have gone too far with the big non-explainable models? What if you're using AI for something like sales forecasting, say, does it really matter if you can explain what the rationale was?
I think it still does, right? I think you have to look at the consequence of the decision, right? So if we're going to produce a picture of a 5-legged elephant, right, with generative AI, it probably doesn't matter, right? That's art, and if we don't like the picture, we throw it away. There's no consequence there. But if I'm going to do a sales forecast, right, and I have shareholders that are impacted, I have employees that are impacted, I have bonuses that are impacted, then that's a very consequential decision. And one where, at the very least, right, I should have understanding and confidence in how the analytic reached an outcome, right, or a recommendation. And so I'd say that this sort of concept on models that are more interpretable and maybe simpler, so that we understand and we feel comfortable in the assumptions that went into those models or what was learned by those models to make the decision, that we understand that so we can have confidence in the models, right? One of the things that I think about, Kevin, is like in the last year, right, customer confidence in models, AI in particular, has gone down considerably. Consumers, like 60% roughly, depending on which survey, have a lot of concern about use of AI. Businesses themselves have concerns about using AI because they don't feel like they have it under control, right? And even in the financial sector, same thing. So I think we are at a sort of like tipping point where folks are going to say, well, that's all cool that we can use 1,000 GPUs to create a model, but do we need to? And what do we lose? Do we lose our ability to actually interpret or have trust in the model? And I think a lot of people run into that, even if it's not a regulated environment, that they are sort of contemplating the use of the model.
So how should an organization think about the trade-offs in terms of they adopt a large language model or something that's not today particularly interpretable versus the alternatives?
Yeah. So I think one needs to figure out what is the best tool for the job, right? And so I've had this conversation with many executives where I try to explain to them that there are different AIs for different purposes, right? And in general, right, we should use the simplest and minimalistic solution, right, to solve a problem, right? So if I can solve a problem with a relatively simple interpretable model, right, or even a linear model, maybe that's the best thing because I want to provide a lot of confidence in that decision and I need that level of transparency, right? If you really need to goose up the performance, right, the detection capabilities, then maybe you get more complicated and you'll have like an interpretable neural network, which is something that we focus on, which allows that level of learning those imputed relationships that drive decisions, but can still be interpreted, right? I would argue there's very few use cases probably where, at least in business context, that you have to go to completely unexplainable models, right? Even if you look at interpreting text and classifying text, you can do that without full generative AI models that will hallucinate and that are unexplainable. And so I think just stepping back and making sure that you say, what is the minimalistic sort of solution that would solve this business problem and treat it as a business problem, not as a science, right, problem where you're interested in science, right? We're all interested in cool science, right? But if we're asking a business problem, right, people will say, where can I get to 85, 90, 95% of a solution and still have an ability to rationalize this, explain it to my board, explain it to my manager or my governance team. And as soon as we put on our business hats, the risk versus reward is very much like a typical CRO sort of conversation that you'd have in terms of what risks you're willing to take. And getting that extra little bit of detection, but potentially, let's say, discriminating against a group of individuals, not a great trade-off, right? And that's where I think some of those decisions come back down to just making those solid business decisions.
What are some of the things that you've done at FICO to make your AI systems more accountable?
So what we focus on is establishing what is our model governance standards at the company. So we have a firm belief that, and we use the term responsible AI versus accountable. I like the term accountable AI, but in my mind, accountable AI kind of implies that like I'm accountable for the wrongs that I've done. And that's true, right? But I would rather have a responsible strategy that says this is the right way or this is the company way of doing it. So at the very start of it is a model governance document, that model development governance standard for how all models get developed, right? Because if I have 200 or 300, 400 data scientists, I can't have them all making decisions around how to choose an algorithm or what's the right way to explain a model or how do we deal with ethics, right? So we have, these are the models you're allowed to use. This is how we explain the models. This is how we do the ethics. And so the first step is having that model development standard that everyone follows. The second major step then is having an enforcement tool, right? And it sounds a little bit like we're restricting creativity of data scientists, and we are to a certain extent, because like customers and our customers are not lab experiments, right? We need to make sure that we are using technology that is proven and understood. And so we enforce that today through the use of blockchain, right? Where decisions get made where we show that like these are the 27 things you need to show done as part of the model development standard, and then have a proof of record that each were done, tested, and approved. And that allows us to release models that meet a model development standard. And the consequences are great, right? One major sort of advantage is that everyone follows the same standard, right? And so you have less errors and issues when models get released. The other major piece is all that energy that people put into like governing models, right? Where there might be thousands of models and 1,000 different conversations, all get funneled down into let's improve the model development standard, right? And then use things like blockchain to enforce. So it's really gotten us much more tactical and actually much more efficient in how we develop high quality models at scale in an understandable, predictable way. And then we focus back to the data science creativity, we focus our innovation on improving the standard, right? And then we treat developing models as a production process off of that standard.
So let me unpack those two pieces. You talked about, you start with the standards and the ethics. So where do those come from?
Yeah, so the standards are ones that are typically defined by someone like myself within an organization that has like a broad purview of the problems that we solve, the pluses and minuses of different algorithms, and then making them hard decisions, right? There's certain algorithms that we just do not allow to be used at FICO, right? Because they're not deemed explainable, or they're not deemed ethical, or they have so many parameters that just science would dictate that you can't collect enough data to actually specify all those parameters properly, and therefore you have low confidence in models. And so I'm part of that. Part of that would be our legal teams and ethics people and also business owners, right? That might have very, very keen views on how regulated AI specifies that certain regulation needs to be met. And so that all gets folded into that model development standard. It gets kind of through that sort of set of stakeholders, and then once defined, right, then it's operationalized.
And then on the second piece, why blockchain? And I actually do a lot of work on blockchain and digital assets. So I was very excited to hear about the work you're doing there. I understand you've gotten patents and awards for it, but can you expand a little bit more about what the value is of using a distributed ledger for that kind of audit trail?
Yeah. So we started this responsible AI journey a very long time ago. And we started with these concepts of what we call analytic tracking documents. So, and I treated it as a contract back then. And then there was a contract between myself and the business owners and my scientists, and there were named resources and tasks that needed to be done. And we would enforce it through weekly stand-ups, right? Sprint reviews, agile development processes. And we made a lot of progress there, but things could slip through the cracks, right? Because if I didn't ask the right questions or if something wasn't presented sufficiently, right, we would basically go through that process in a human way to ensure that it's enforced. With the blockchain, though, right, we're able to sort of automate all of that, right? And the reason why we use the blockchain is number one, we have that immutable chain, right? Because I want to see the history of what we did well and what we struggled with, right? And maybe I completed a task and one of my scientists tested it and said, no, Scott, you're wrong. You didn't meet that task. I want that on the blockchain. And so the immutability means that people take things seriously. So back 15 years ago, when they actually had to sign a piece of paper with me, like a little mini mock contract, when you put your signature on a piece of paper, it still means something, right? Same with the blockchain. As soon as I commit it as done on the blockchain, it's there, it's immutable. I take it seriously, right? And then the people after me that are checking that work and verifying that work, their names are on the ledger, right? And they're taking it seriously. And so it provides a sort of level of accountability because we know that it's going to be on that ledger. We know that it's immutable and that we're not going to be able to change it. And it also establishes tremendous trust, right? Because I can open that distributed ledger or private ledger to regulators, to governance teams, where they see exactly what was there, right? And if Scott was particularly bad on a task and he messed it up 7 times, and 7 times his data scientists rejected it, right? And maybe eventually Scott was taken off that task and was replaced by Julie. That's fine, right? But that is the level of sort of clarity and transparency and seriousness around meeting that standard. And if you look at regulators, they don't have that level of transparency. So it drives the right behaviors in a data science program. It also provides that level of trust when it comes to explaining how the model is built, because there's no disagreement, right? There's no like, well, I think it does this, right? If we say, for example, Kevin, I say, well, these are the latent features that are learned, right? They're persistent in the blockchain. There's no I think it is, or I thought it might be. No, if the requirement is I have to tell you what all the latent features are and what the relationships were learned, that's on the blockchain. And if later on a governance person or ethics person, lawyer, regulator wants to look at that and they say, ooh, we don't like that latent feature, that's fine. That's the conversation that needs to be had, right? And so that's one of the reasons. But it's enforcement, it's accountability. And frankly, you'd think data scientists wouldn't like it, but it actually provides tremendous comfort because unfortunately, most data scientists are put in situations where they're ill-equipped to take on that level of responsibility. So it also protects them. So it's a sort of happy harmony of kind of benefits. And then frankly, after that, when the model gets released, it only gets released when all those requirements are met and accepted, and you have that full history. That blockchain goes with the model to where it gets deployed. And it's also the thing that lives with the model so that later on, a year from now, 2 years from now, when there's questions about what that model does and who built it, why they built it, why is it behaving this way, you can go look into that blockchain, understand what's inside the model. And moreover, today, we actually put in the entire requirements of how you monitor it, right? Which is another big issue in AI, right? How do you monitor these models? And so the only person that really knows how to do that is the person who built it. Might as well codify that at the time it was built and say, these are the operating parameters for my model. And then you run it in production that way.
It sounds like a lot of overhead, though. How do you build all that into the workflows?
So there is work. And so we have a UI that we essentially codify all those requirements. And so as part of the model development process, they have to list that in, right? I don't think it's any incremental effort. It's more about kind of organizing. Right. So like you think about like my desk is actually, you can't see it, but it's a big mess. And so like it's very cluttered. Right. And there's order that I understand, but I don't think you'd understand necessarily unless you're as cluttered as I am. So we're structuring the work in that the requirements get met. There is overhead, but without that, we'd have to go back and maybe answer questions that should have been answered a month ago or 6 weeks ago. And so we actually find that it's more efficient because we've actually codified exactly what a governance team will be looking for, exactly how we're going to report the reasons for how a model behaved. And so there's more work up front to organize that work into a structured way or on that model governance standard, but there's so much less work after, right, or during the model build because you've already satisfied all the requirements. One of the things that's interesting to me is there's still a lot of organizations that have model governance teams, right? And a model governance team generally operates that I build the model, I throw it over to you. You don't know anything about the model. You start asking questions, right? The questions may or may not be relevant. You may or may not have the same level of expertise in what I've done. These governance processes can take 9 months, right? I would rather say when the model is released, you and I, if you're the governance person, Kevin, you and I are agreed on what you need to see. And as proof of work, right, when that model is released, it's shown, right? You can go look at the blockchain. And so in some sense, it drives all that governance into the model development process. So it's not an entirely different process that oftentimes takes twice as long or 3 times as long as actually developing the model in the first place.
Yeah, do you think there will be more pressure for that kind of approach? Because certainly in banking, we have model risk management standards and those kinds of requirements. But as we talk now, especially with generative AI, where you've got companies that are building the models, other companies that are adapting them to applications, and then companies are taking those and doing a rag chain and so forth. Now you have a lot more organizations that are somehow touching or dependent on the model, and then something goes wrong.
Yeah.
So is this kind of audit trail, you think, going to be ultimately what organizations need to go to?
I think it most absolutely will be, right. And so like you look at the work that people do in LLMs, right, and I look at different proof of concepts that people want to do, and we obviously do proof of concepts here at FICO. We also do core research in this area. We've been doing it for 20 years in generative AI. But there's a lot of imprecision in what people understand. For example, like RAG, right? You talk about this augmentation, right? But like, what's the parameter on what gets used, what doesn't get used? How do you do the embedding? What's the chunking? What's the overlap? These all really, really matter from a business context perspective. But a lot of it's just kind of glossed over, right, in terms of looking at the outputs. And I think if people are going to go leverage some of these technologies that are a little bit more on the fringe in terms of responsible AI, or then for sure they're going to have to keep track of these as decisions, right? So they can revisit it down the road if they find unsatisfactory results in the use of it. And I think that'll be a big part of where people need to get to. Otherwise, you'll have a model, and even simple models are really hard to understand. So these large applications of generative AI most definitely will have to have a lot of structure. And just picking apart things like RAG, there's a lot of decisions. And then there's a lot of things that people take for granted that they don't truly understand how it works, right? And so from that perspective, just codifying that as a risk or delving in to where they'll use, let's say, a private LLM sort of capabilities versus building their own will be critically important in terms of whether they can faithfully say, listen, yeah, we only use our documentation answering the question, or maybe we don't. Maybe there is hallucination going on there. And I think some of those things have to be codified so that there's some governance around it.
Are there areas where you've changed your mind, or you've realized that you were going the wrong direction in terms of governance and responsibility in recent years?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's an evolving process. I'll put it that way, right? I think with blockchain, I'm very confident that's the direction forward. In fact, right, we're so confident at FICO, right? We have this AI decisioning platform, which was a leader in a Forrester Wave from 2023. And we're using blockchain beyond just models, right? We're using it to kind of keep track of the entire decision process. And so I think the blockchain was a great sort of approach. I think to your point about what is the right sort of heftiness of a process, right? This is still a refinement for us, right? In terms of the pluses and minuses. So I don't think there's anything where we backed away and said, let's take an entirely different direction. But what we have tried to do is try to figure out how to make it as less burdensome as possible. That's why a big part of it, the challenge wasn't a model development standard for FICO, because that's core to our business. And our challenge wasn't blockchain technology. That's the one you can get your hands around. Our challenge was like how to come up with a UI so the data scientists don't spend a lot of time having to worry about that. And we did that, right? And so that's one of my core focuses is like, okay, making sure that user experience for a data scientist is good. I don't, like, if I have a world-class data scientist, I don't need her being a world-class blockchain sort of whisperer either, right? I mean, and this is where most machine learning teams and AI teams today that build models have these areas of specialty. And I think that's been one of the major learnings is just no one human being can encompass all that in one head, right? And so figuring out what that ML ops needs to look like, and nowadays maybe regulated AI ops, if you will, right, is really important.
What are you hearing from customers, or when you go out there and talk to people about their thoughts on responsibility in AI?
Yeah, so The customers are really intrigued by the use of let's say, the audible AI concepts that we have and blockchain. They're under pressure. Some more than 50% of in one of a survey we did a couple of years back, 50% of financial institutions in the United States don't have model standards, right? And roughly 60% of banks say that they're very concerned they don't have a handle on how to control bias and fairness in development of models when it comes to AI. And so we see customers that are a little bit nervous about their abilities to do this in a very tactical way and in a very certain way. In addition to that, right, they see this as one way that they're going to have to respond to upcoming AI regulation, right? We saw the EU AI Act is marching ahead, right? Many organizations are starting to already codify how they're going to respond to that AI regulation, right? Which comes down to, let's go through all the little bullet points of things that we need to demonstrate, right? And then how do we do that, right? And I think they recognize for themselves, particularly if they don't have a model development standard, that it's all over the place. And so they find this as one way to kind of, herd cats, if you will, and get more efficient, right? And I think organizations that do that, right, will find benefits, right? It might be a little bit of time to do all that work, but frankly, where AI regulation is going today and consumer trust is heading right now, right, it's a necessary sort of task that people need to do. But once they do it, right, you'll have teams that are supercharged at doing it and doing it very efficiently. And I think that's where you start to get these multiples of productivity, just because people are so used to doing that, versus you and I sitting there and looking at a particular type of model and figuring out how the hell we're going to explain this thing, right? And then being able to sleep at night and make sure that we were able to do it, right, is a challenge, versus having a tried and true proven method, right? Again, right, when we solve business problems, and that's what a lot of our customers do, right, it's not about algorithm A versus algorithm B. It's about outcomes. And so them just having that path is really important. And then being able to show that they followed the path appropriately and defend it, super important to them.
What do you think is the biggest challenge going forward?
I think that one of the biggest challenges is the AI regulation that's coming, right? So when generative AI, the large language model thing popped up, right, it took almost all the oxygen out of the room. And I was involved in so many conversations that were just utter nonsense, right? About, oh, we don't need data scientists anymore, right? We don't, and these things are super intelligent. And I think now, right, we have gotten to a more sensible place where people understand that these large language models are cool and they're fun and they're interesting, right? They're also not meant for many regulated environments. They also predict the next token in a sequence of tokens. They're not some uber intelligence, right? Even if we feel that they are based on how they talk to us, communicate. So we are all smartening up and letting the hype cycle die down. But we lost like a year and a half or 2 years on responsible AI journeys. So like when I mentioned earlier, about 50% of organizations don't have an AI governance standard at all, right? Which means Jack and Jill are building models entirely differently at their organizations, and there might be hundreds or thousands of Jacks and Jills, right? That's a huge problem when regulation is going to insist that you write a report for every single model, and you can justify that you followed the regulations, let's say. And I think this is our biggest sort of challenge. In some sense, it's a positive because responsible AI will have to get real really, really quickly. But for those laggards, right, in defining those standards, there's going to be a lot of work to do, which means they need to figure out who in the industry is leading in those spaces and try to mirror some of that so they can kind of catch up and define those governance standards themselves for how they develop and operationalize models.
So that's interesting. You think that all the excitement around LLMs and Gen AI got organizations to take their eye off the ball somewhat in terms of responsibility?
Absolutely. Yeah. And frankly, right, all that LLM generative AI hype also caused regulation to speed up, right? And so like the Biden administration and putting out their AI guidance, right? A lot of it was predicated not on using AI or machine learning to make, let's say, a credit risk decision. A lot of it was based on, wow, look at all of these LLM live experiments on consumers, right? Where organizations, including the big organizations that build these models, can't explain it. And I think that created a lot of that trust issue, and it also created a lot of concern in the regulatory environment. So I think it most definitely people took their eye off the ball, but it also raised this sort of heightened concern about, which direction are we going here, right? And that's why, like, if you look at the EU regulation in detail, right, you got a very high risk and different classifications of AI for the purposes of just saying, okay, there are some types of models where we're going to have to be much more pragmatic, and it might take 3 or 4 months to build that model with 2 or 3 people, because we're going to build it very, very carefully, right? It's not about spin the model on a set of GPUs and be done with it, right? And I think that's one of the challenges that we've had with generative AI. But I do think it's all coming around, and if regulation continues to go the direction it is, there'll be no choice, right? You'll have to kind of catch up. But most definitely, right, those were not the conversations for many different organizations. And it has been frustrating for some, where they see that people are more enamored with what a generative AI will produce than trying to properly develop models in a trustworthy and accountable way, and having some of those hard decisions about a model development standard.
Well, but I'm glad to hear that after all of that, you're still optimistic. It sounds like that organization are going to get to where they need to go. So many important issues. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you, Scott. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thank you.
This has been The Road to Accountable AI. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a good review and check out my Substack for more insights on AI accountability. Thank you for listening.